Auron lived a life of solitude on the distant planet of Kaelis IV. As a planetary surveyor, his days were spent charting the planet's vast and uncharted jungles, their bioluminescent flora casting a soft, surreal glow that illuminated the alien landscape. The trees shimmered with vibrant blues and greens, and at night, the entire forest came alive as if the stars themselves had fallen from the sky to dance among the leaves. Despite the breathtaking beauty of the planet, Auron's existence was lonely. There were no other humans on Kaelis IV. His only company was the strange creatures that inhabited the jungle, some dangerous, some harmless, all entirely alien. He had grown accustomed to the quiet, to the endless stretches of days that blended into one another, to the isolation. It was a peaceful life, if not a fulfilling one, but all that was about to change. One evening, as dusk settled over the forest, Auron found himself trekking along the edge of Nyros Gorge, a vast chasm that cut through the jungle like a deep wound in the earth. The cliffs were treacherous, with sharp rocks jutting out from the sides and a roaring river far below. Few ventured near the gorge. It was too dangerous, even for a seasoned surveyor like Auron. As he carefully navigated the rocky terrain, the low hum of the jungle was suddenly interrupted by a sound that froze him in place. It was a cry, high-pitched, desperate, and unlike anything he had ever heard before. It echoed off the cliffs, carried by the wind, and Auron's heart immediately began to race. He hesitated only for a moment, scanning the area for the source of the cry. Was it a person? An animal? He couldn't be sure, but something deep inside urged him to move. Without a second thought, he sprinted toward the sound, adrenaline surging through his veins. The closer he got, the louder the cry became, and he realized with growing alarm that it was coming from the base of the gorge. When he finally reached the edge of the cliff and peered down, Auron's breath caught in his throat. Below him, swirling in the violent waters at the base of a massive waterfall, was a creature unlike anything he had ever seen. It was enormous, at least 3 times the size of any predator he'd encountered on the planet, and it was caught in the deadly grip of the river's whirlpool. Its sleek, feline form was covered in thick, shimmering fur that glowed faintly in the fading light, and its powerful limbs thrashed against the current as it struggled to free itself. Auron's mind raced. The creature, though alien, resembled a lynx, though much larger and far more majestic. Its glowing fur shimmered like starlight, but the panic in its glowing eyes was unmistakable. It was drowning. Without thinking, Auron dropped his equipment and began to descend the cliff, his hands gripping the jagged rocks as he carefully made his way down. The wind whipped around him, and the sound of the roaring waterfall filled his ears, but he focused only on reaching the creature. The ground was slick, and his boots slipped several times on the wet rocks, but he pushed forward, ignoring the danger. When he finally reached the bottom, the force of the waterfall spray soaked him to the bone, but Auron didn't care. His eyes were locked on the struggling creature, now barely keeping its head above water. He could see the raw power in its muscles, the desperation in its movements, and something inside him refused to let it die. Auron waded into the river, the freezing water tugging at him with frightening strength. His heart pounded in his chest as he fought the current, each step a battle against the relentless force of the whirlpool. The lynx thrashed wildly, but Auron was determined. He reached out, his fingers just barely brushing the creature's slick fur before the current nearly pulled him under. With a grunt of effort, Auron lunged forward, grabbing onto the lynx's massive paw and pulling with everything he had. The current fought back, but Auron held on, using every ounce of strength to drag the creature free from the deadly vortex. It was a struggle, a fight for survival against the river's unyielding power, but finally, with one last desperate pull, Auron managed to get the lynx out of the whirlpool and onto the rocky shore. Both of them collapsed, gasping for air, their bodies battered and exhausted. Auron lay on the cold stone, his chest heaving as he caught his breath, the roar of the waterfall still echoing in his ears. The lynx lay beside him, equally spent, but alive. Its glowing eyes, once wild with fear, were now calm, reflecting the pale light of the alien sky above. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Auron could hardly believe what had just happened. He had risked his life to save a creature he didn't know, on a planet where survival was never guaranteed. But as he lay there, staring up at the stars, he felt something stir inside him, something beyond the usual isolation and emptiness. This wasn't just another day on Kaelis IV. Something had shifted. As the lynx slowly regained its strength, it stood up on shaky legs, towering over Auron. It was even more magnificent up close, its fur glowing softly in the twilight, shimmering with an otherworldly beauty. Auron watched in awe as the creature shook the water from its coat, its glowing eyes now focused on him with an intelligence that sent a shiver down his spine. And then, Auron noticed something strange, a pendant around the lynx's neck, hidden beneath its thick fur. The pendant was delicate, yet clearly ancient, inscribed with strange, shimmering symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. This was no ordinary beast. Auron stared at the pendant, his heart racing with a new sense of wonder and curiosity. The lynx wasn't just a wild animal. It was connected to something far greater, something ancient and powerful. And now, Auron realized, he was caught up in it. Whatever this creature was, wherever it had come from, it had just changed his life forever. The air around the waterfall was thick with mist, and Auron's clothes clung to his skin, drenched from the rescue. The massive lynx-like creature stood beside him, its bioluminescent fur shimmering faintly in the fading light. Auron's breath was still ragged, his muscles aching from the struggle with the river's brutal current. He had barely processed the fact that he had just saved a creature so strange, yet so majestic. But there was something else, something that held his attention and sent a rush of questions through his mind. The pendant. It hung loosely around the creature's neck, swaying slightly as the lynx regained its strength. The pendant was unlike anything Auron had ever seen. Delicate yet ancient, it was etched with intricate, glowing symbols that shifted in the dim light, as if alive with a power of its own. Auron's instincts told him that this wasn't some ordinary trinket. This pendant, and by extension, the lynx, was part of something far bigger. "What are you?" Auron whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of the waterfall. The creature didn't answer, of course, but its glowing eyes, sharp and intelligent, seemed to acknowledge his words. It wasn't just a wild animal. There was an awareness in those eyes, a recognition. Auron felt the lynx studying him just as intensely as he had been examining it. Auron cautiously extended a hand toward the pendant, curiosity overcoming his exhaustion. The glowing symbols pulsed softly, their light hypnotic. As his fingers brushed against the cold metal, a jolt of energy shot up his arm, sending a shiver through his entire body. He pulled his hand back instinctively, eyes wide. Okay, definitely not normal. The lynx took a step back, but did not run. It seemed to understand that Auron meant no harm. Instead, it turned its massive head toward the thick jungle beyond the waterfall, as if sensing something far away. Auron noticed its posture tense, its ears twitching. Something, or someone, was drawing its attention. Then, without warning, the creature began to walk, moving slowly but purposefully toward the edge of the jungle. Auron stood frozen for a moment, watching it vanish into the shadows of the towering bioluminescent trees. But before it disappeared completely, the lynx turned its head, looking back at Auron as if expecting him to follow. Auron's mind raced. He had spent years on Kaelis IV, mapping its strange landscapes and cataloging its alien wildlife. But he had never encountered anything like this. This was something deeper, something connected to the planet's ancient history. He had a choice: stay in the safety of what he knew, or follow the creature into the unknown. He hesitated for only a moment. Something inside him, perhaps curiosity, perhaps instinct, urged him forward. Auron grabbed his pack, slung it over his shoulder, and started after the lynx. He moved quickly, his boots crunching on the damp forest floor as he followed the creature's glowing form through the thick underbrush. The jungle around them grew darker as the sun dipped lower in the sky, but the soft glow of the bioluminescent plants provided enough light to see by. The lynx moved with grace, navigating the terrain effortlessly, while Auron struggled to keep up. Roots and vines tangled underfoot, and low-hanging branches slapped against him as he pushed his way through the dense foliage. His breathing was heavy, but he was determined not to lose sight of the creature. After what felt like hours of trekking through the jungle, they emerged into a clearing. Auron stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. Before him stood a massive stone structure, ancient and overgrown with vines. The ruins were unlike anything he had ever seen on Kaelis IV. The stones were carved with the same strange symbols that adorned the Lynx's pendant, glowing faintly in the dim light. The air around the ruins felt thick with age, as if the very ground remembered the passage of time. It was clear that this place had been forgotten for centuries, maybe longer. The Lynx moved to the center of the clearing and stopped in front of the largest stone structure. Auron followed, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of the ruins. He had no idea how long they had been here, or who had built them, but it was clear that the structure held great significance. "What is this place?" Auron murmured, more to himself than to the creature. The Lynx gave no answer, but it stepped closer to a specific section of the ruin, a set of stone doors partially hidden by overgrown vines and moss. The symbols etched into the stone glowed brighter as the creature approached. Auron felt a strange sensation, like the air was alive with energy, responding to the presence of the Lynx. Without hesitation, the Lynx pressed its massive paw against the stone. To Auron's amazement, the ancient door shuddered and slowly began to open, revealing a dark chamber within. Auron's pulse quickened. The air inside the chamber was cool, almost unnaturally so, and carried the faint smell of ancient stone. As he stepped inside, following the Lynx's lead, the glow from the pendant lit up the chamber, illuminating what lay within. In the center of the room, surrounded by more glowing symbols, was a stasis pod. Auron's eyes widened as he approached it cautiously. The pod, made of some strange, translucent material, hummed softly with energy. Inside, suspended in a deep sleep, was a small, delicate figure, a child. Auron took a step closer, his heart racing. The child was unlike any species he had ever encountered. Its skin was a shimmering shade of sapphire blue, and its features were graceful, almost ethereal. The child looked fragile, barely moving in its suspended state. Auron felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. What was a child doing here? How long had it been in stasis? And more importantly, why? The Lynx, now standing beside the stasis pod, looked at Auron with calm, intelligent eyes. For the first time since their encounter, Auron understood the truth. This wasn't just a wild creature. It was a guardian. The pendant, the ruins, the stasis pod. It was all connected. The Lynx had been protecting this child, possibly for centuries, waiting for someone to come. But what was the child's purpose? And why did the Lynx choose Auron to witness this moment? Auron's thoughts raced, but before he could ask himself any more questions, a sound cut through the air, the unmistakable hum of engines overhead. His stomach dropped. He turned to the entrance of the ruins, his heart pounding in his chest. Through the cracks in the stone ceiling, Auron saw them. A fleet of alien ships descending rapidly, their searchlights scanning the jungle floor. They were searching for something. No, someone. The child. Auron's blood ran cold. Whoever was in those ships knew exactly what they were looking for, and they had found it. The ruins trembled slightly as the ships approached, their engines sending vibrations through the ground. He turned to the Lynx, now fully alert, its glowing eyes locked on him. Auron understood. They needed to leave now. "Come on," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to himself or the Lynx. "We've got to get out of here." The Lynx moved swiftly, nudging Auron toward a hidden passage at the back of the chamber. Auron followed without hesitation, casting one last glance at the child in the stasis pod. Whoever this child was, whatever its importance, they were in grave danger. With the ships closing in, Auron knew that their time was running out. He had stumbled into something far beyond what he could have ever imagined, and now he was responsible for it. As they disappeared into the shadows of the passage, the ruins echoed with the distant sound of alien engines, and Auron felt a cold certainty settle over him. The hunt had begun. The low hum of the alien fleet reverberated through the ancient ruins, sending a chill down Auron's spine. The air felt heavy, thick with an impending sense of danger. Outside, Beyond the crumbling walls of the forgotten structure, the sky was ablaze with the eerie glow of descending ships, their dark silhouettes blotting out the stars. These weren't ordinary ships. There was something about their movement, their precision, that told Auron they were searching for something specific. And now, he feared, they had found it. He glanced toward the stasis chamber. The child inside, Aera, as he would soon come to know her, remained peacefully asleep, unaware of the danger approaching. Her sapphire blue skin glowed faintly under the soft, protective light of the chamber. The lynx, now clearly more than a mere animal, stood alert at her side, its glowing eyes watching Auron, waiting for him to act. Panic began to rise in Auron's chest, but he fought to remain calm. He had no idea who the alien ships belonged to, or what they wanted, but he knew one thing with certainty. They couldn't be allowed to take Aera. As the roar of engines grew louder, Auron's mind raced, trying to figure out their next move. The lynx, Valen, as he instinctively began to call it, seemed to sense the urgency too. The creature moved closer to Auron, nudging him gently with its massive head, as if urging him to act quickly. "What now?" Auron whispered to himself, glancing nervously between Valen and the stasis chamber. Just then, Valen let out a low growl, his eyes locked on the entrance to the ruin. Without warning, he turned and darted toward a narrow passage hidden behind a cluster of ancient stones. Auron hesitated only for a moment, realizing that Valen wanted him to follow. He took a deep breath and hurried to the chamber where Aera lay, his hands trembling as he searched for a way to open it. The symbols on the chamber glowed with an otherworldly light, and as his fingers brushed the surface, the glass-like material of the chamber shifted, dissolving into mist. Auron stepped back, startled, as the protective shell around Aera disappeared. For a moment, everything seemed still. Then, the little girl stirred. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, revealing irises of an intense silver, shimmering with an intelligence far beyond her apparent age. Aera blinked, confused, her delicate frame barely moving as she adjusted to her surroundings. She seemed fragile, yet there was something undeniably powerful about her presence. Auron kneeled beside her, his voice gentle. "Aera," he whispered, though he didn't know how he had come to know her name. "It simply felt right. We need to leave. It's not safe here." Aera looked at him, her silver eyes reflecting a deep understanding. Without a word, she reached out a small hand, placing it on Auron's arm. As soon as her fingers made contact with his skin, a wave of warmth surged through him, calming his racing thoughts. It was as if Aera had spoken directly to his mind, reassuring him, telling him she trusted him. Without wasting any more time, Auron lifted her into his arms. She was light as a feather, her skin cool to the touch, and he moved quickly toward the passage where Valen had disappeared. Behind them, the sound of the ships grew louder, and the unmistakable clank of metal footsteps echoed through the entrance of the ruins. "They've landed," Auron muttered under his breath, pushing himself to move faster. He squeezed through the narrow gap in the stone, Aera safely cradled in his arms, and emerged into a dimly lit tunnel. The air inside was damp, the smell of ancient stone and earth overwhelming his senses. Valen was just ahead, his glowing form guiding the way. The tunnel sloped downward, spiraling deeper beneath the ruins, and Auron realized it must have been some kind of ancient escape route. As they descended, the temperature dropped, and the walls of the tunnel began to shimmer with faint symbols, much like the ones on the pendant around Valen's neck. The farther they went, the more the symbols seemed to come alive, pulsing with an almost sentient glow. Auron couldn't help but feel that the tunnel was responding to Aera's presence, as if it had been waiting for her return. Behind them, the distant sound of footsteps grew fainter, but Auron knew it wouldn't be long before their pursuers found the hidden entrance. They needed to get as far away as possible, and fast. At last, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, the ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. In the center of the room stood a massive stone structure, circular in shape, with a platform at its core. Surrounding it were stone pillars covered in the same glowing symbols, humming with energy. Valen stopped at the edge of the platform and turned to face Auron, his eyes locking onto Aera. The girl, still quiet in Auron's arms, looked around with an expression of recognition, as if she had been there before. "What is this place?" Auron asked aloud, though he wasn't expecting an answer. Valen stepped onto the platform, and the moment his paws touched the stone, the entire structure began to hum with life. The pillars around them brightened, and a low, rhythmic sound filled the air, like the beating of a giant heart. Auron felt the ground vibrate beneath his feet, and a surge of energy crackled through the room. Aera, who had remained silent until now, suddenly lifted her head, her silver eyes glowing brighter than before. She spoke, her voice soft but filled with a strange power. "It's a gateway." Auron's eyes widened. A gateway to where? Before she could answer, the ground beneath them shook violently. The stone structure lit up with blinding intensity, and Auron had to shield his eyes from the light. He could feel the air around him shift, as if the very fabric of space was being pulled apart. The platform they stood on began to glow, and the symbols on the pillars spun around them like constellations in motion. In that moment, Auron realized what was happening. This place, this ancient ruin, wasn't just a sanctuary. It was a key to something far greater, and whatever forces were chasing them, they were getting closer. But then, without warning, the chamber went silent. The humming stopped, the lights dimmed, and the energy in the room seemed to dissipate. Auron blinked, confused. Valen was still standing on the platform, watching Aera, waiting. And then, Aera's eyes flickered. "They're here," she whispered. The silence that followed Aera's soft whisper hung heavy in the chamber. Auron's heart raced, his instinct screaming that they had little time left. He looked around, trying to make sense of the sudden stillness, but all his senses were locked onto Aera's words. "They're here." Outside, the echo of footsteps and strange mechanical sounds bounced off the stone walls of the tunnel they had just escaped from. Whoever the pursuers were, they had made it past the entrance of the ruins and were closing in fast. Aera, still in Auron's arms, remained eerily calm, her silver eyes reflecting the dim glow of the ancient chamber. Valen, the massive lynx-like creature, stood silently on the platform, his gaze sharp, fixed on the entrance as if waiting for the inevitable confrontation. His body was tense, muscles rippling under his gleaming fur, ready to defend them if needed. Auron swallowed hard. His mind raced with questions. What did these beings want with Aera? And why did they seem so desperate to find her? He could sense that this child was no ordinary being, but her connection to the ruins, to the ancient technology, and to the impending danger remained a mystery. He stepped forward, toward the platform where Valen stood, his body still carrying the weight of Aera's small frame. The symbols etched into the stone pillars surrounding the platform began to pulse faintly again, responding to their movement. Auron's eyes flicked nervously between the glowing runes and the shadowy entrance they had emerged from, knowing that the hunters were moments away from bursting in. "We can't stay here," Auron said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to find another way out." But before he could even think of moving again, the chamber was suddenly bathed in a sharp, blinding light. Auron instinctively shielded Aera, his body tightening as he twisted to face the source of the light. The hunters had arrived. Silhouetted against the blinding backdrop stood three figures, each encased in sleek, black armor that shimmered faintly with the glow of advanced technology. They carried weapons, long, slender rifles that hummed with a dangerous, silent energy. Their helmets covered their faces entirely, but Auron could feel the coldness of their gaze locked onto him. "Aera and Valen. Step away from the child," one of them said, the voice distorted through a mechanical filter, turning the command into something inhuman. Auron's pulse quickened. He shifted slightly, pulling Aera closer, her small body light but warm in his arms. Valen moved too, his enormous frame placing itself protectively between Auron and the advancing figures, a low growl building in his throat. The air in the chamber crackled with tension. Auron could sense the raw power in these beings. Whoever they were far beyond the typical alien scouts or mercenaries. These were specialists, hunters of the highest order, and they wanted Aera. "What do you want with her?" Auron asked, his voice tight with anger. "She's just a child. She is far more than that," The lead figure responded, taking another step forward. The sound of metal boots clanging against stone echoed unnervingly in the chamber. You don't understand what she is and what she will become. Surrender her now, and we will let you live. Auron's mind raced. Surrender? He barely knew what was happening, but something deep inside told him that giving Aera to these hunters would be a terrible mistake, one that the galaxy might not recover from. Before he could respond, Aera stirred in his arms. She lifted her head, her silver eyes glowing more intensely now. Her voice, though soft, filled the chamber with a strange authority. You won't take me, she said. Her words echoed with an unsettling power, and in that moment, something shifted in the air. The symbols on the pillars, which had dimmed moments before, now flared to life. The light from them pulsed violently, and Auron felt the energy in the room change, as if the ancient structure itself was waking up. The hunters took a step back, their armor gleaming in the bright light. The leader raised their rifle, aiming it directly at Auron and Aera. Enough! The hunter barked, their voice carrying a note of frustration. We will not leave without her. Suddenly, before the hunter could fire, Vaylin lunged forward with a speed that defied his size. His body became a blur of glowing fur and claws as he leaped at the lead hunter, knocking them backward with a powerful strike. The force of the impact sent the hunter crashing into the stone wall, their weapon clattering to the ground. The other two hunters reacted instantly, raising their rifles to fire at Vaylin. Auron ducked, pulling Aera behind one of the stone pillars as beams of deadly energy shot across the room, scorching the ancient walls. Stay low, Auron whispered urgently to Aera, his voice barely audible over the chaos of the fight. Vaylin fought ferociously, his claws slashing through the air, his massive body dancing between the blasts of energy. But it was clear that even he was struggling to hold back the sheer force of the hunter's weapons. Auron's mind raced. They were trapped. Even with Vaylin's protection, the hunters were too powerful, too advanced. They wouldn't be able to hold them off for long. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Auron noticed something. The platform in the center of the room. The symbols on it had been glowing more intensely since Aera had spoken, and the energy from the pillars seemed to be feeding into it. It wasn't just a structure, it was a mechanism, a gateway, just like Aera had said. His heart pounded as the realization hit him. The platform wasn't just part of the ruins, it was their way out. Aera, he called over the sound of the battle. The platform, it's the gateway, isn't it? She nodded, her expression calm but focused. It will take us somewhere safe, but it needs time to activate. Auron gritted his teeth. Time was the one thing they didn't have. Vaylin, Auron shouted, hoping the Guardian could hear him over the noise. We need to hold them off until the gateway is ready. Vaylin, locked in combat with the remaining hunters, growled in acknowledgement. He leapt at one of the attackers, knocking their weapon out of their hand before turning to fend off the other. His massive body moved with deadly precision, but the hunters were relentless, pressing forward with every step. Auron placed Aera on the platform, and as soon as her feet touched the stone, the entire room began to hum with energy. The symbols on the pillars flared brighter, and the platform beneath them began to shift, spinning slowly as the gateway activated. But the hunters weren't done. One of them, faster than Auron could react, broke free from Vaylin's attacks and lunged at the platform, weapon drawn. Auron barely had time to raise his arm in defense when the hunter's weapon came down toward him. A blinding light erupted from the platform, and Auron's vision was consumed by the swirling glow of the gateway. The energy around them intensified, the air crackling as the very fabric of space seemed to warp and bend. And then, everything went white. For a moment, Auron felt weightless, suspended in the blinding white void as the roar of battle vanished. The sensation was disorienting, like being caught between two realities. He tried to focus, but the sheer intensity of the light made it impossible to see or feel anything tangible. It was as though time itself had been stripped away, leaving him drifting in a strange, timeless space. Then, as abruptly as it had started, the light began to fade. Auron felt solid ground beneath his feet again, and the oppressive brightness softened into a dim, ethereal glow. His eyes struggled to adjust to the sudden shift, and his pulse quickened with uncertainty. The sounds of battle were gone. The hunters, the ruins, the ancient pillars, they had all disappeared. Auron blinked, his vision gradually clearing. They were no longer in the chamber. He looked around, taking in his surroundings. They stood in the middle of what appeared to be a vast, alien landscape, unlike anything he had ever seen before. The sky above was a deep violet, streaked with strange, swirling clouds that pulsed with faint light. Towering structures made of smooth, dark stone rose from the ground, their surfaces covered in the same glowing symbols he had seen in the ruins. The air was cooler here, with a subtle, metallic scent, and the ground beneath his feet had a faint sheen, as if it were alive with energy. Auron's breath caught in his throat. This was no ordinary place. This was another world. He glanced down at Aera, still cradled in his arms. The young girl's silver eyes were wide open now, taking in their new surroundings with a calmness that Auron found almost unsettling. It was as if she had expected this, as if she knew exactly where they were. Where are we? Auron asked, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Aera looked up at him, her expression soft but serious. We've crossed through the gateway. This is a safe place, for now. Vaylin appeared beside them, his massive form materializing out of the mist that swirled around the strange stone towers. The Guardian's fur still glowed faintly, but his eyes were alert, scanning the area for any signs of danger. He seemed more at ease here, as if this was a place he was familiar with, perhaps even a home. Auron gently set Aera down, his legs trembling from the adrenaline of their escape. His mind was still racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened in the last few minutes. They had been moments away from being captured, or worse, by the alien hunters, and now they were, where? Another dimension? Another planet? The questions swirled around him, but there were no answers in sight. Aera stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the violet sky met the dark, jagged mountains in the distance. She seemed unbothered by the strange new world, her small figure standing tall despite the immense alien landscape that loomed around them. This place, Auron began, his voice trailing off as he tried to gather his thoughts. What is it? How did we get here? Aera turned to face him, her silver eyes glowing softly in the dim light. It's a sanctuary. The gateway brought us here to protect us. Protect us from what? Auron asked, his voice tight with frustration. Those hunters? Who are they? Why were they after you? Aera's gaze flickered with a hint of sadness, but she remained composed. They are part of an ancient order, one that seeks to control what I am, what I will become. I am more than just a child, Auron. Auron's brow furrowed as he absorbed her words. He had suspected that Aera was special, but he hadn't expected her to speak with such wisdom and awareness beyond her years. It was as if she carried the weight of an entire history on her shoulders, one he knew nothing about. What do you mean, what you will become? He asked carefully. Aera paused, as if searching for the right words. I am the last of my kind, a descendant of an ancient race that once ruled over many worlds, including Kaelis IV. The hunters you saw, they belong to a faction that fears what I represent. My people had powers that could reshape the galaxy, and those who seek control want to use me for that purpose. Auron felt a chill run down his spine. So, they want to exploit you? Use your power for themselves? She nodded, her expression grave. Yes, and if they succeed, it will bring darkness to many worlds. The weight of her words hit Auron like a blow. He had been drawn into something far bigger than he ever imagined. This wasn't just about surviving on Kaelis IV anymore. This was about a conflict that could ripple through the entire galaxy. And Aera, this quiet, enigmatic child, was at the heart of it all. Auron rubbed his hands over his face, trying to process the enormity of the situation. I don't know how to fight these people, Aera. They're too powerful. I barely escaped with you back there, and that was only because of Vaylin. Vaylin, who had been silently observing the conversation, stepped forward. His eyes met Auron's, and in that moment, Auron sensed a deep, mutual understanding. Vaylin wasn't just a guardian. He was a protector of something far greater, something sacred. And now, Auron was part of that responsibility. We don't have to fight them alone, Aera said softly, breaking the tension. There are others who will help us, but we must find them. Others? Auron asked, hope flickering in his chest. She nodded. My people may be gone, but there are those who remember them, who believe in the balance they once maintained. If we can reach them, we might stand a chance. Auron exhaled, feeling the gravity of the mission ahead. His life as a planetary surveyor had been quiet, isolated. Nothing like the dangerous and unpredictable path he now found himself on. But as he looked at Aera, standing there with her calm, determined gaze, and at Vaylin, the silent but powerful guardian by her side, he knew he couldn't turn back. Where do we start? Auron asked, his voice steady, despite the uncertainty swirling in his mind. Aera glanced at the distant mountains, her eyes narrowing slightly. We must go deeper into this sanctuary. There are things hidden here that will guide us, and people waiting to find us. Before Auron could ask anything more, the ground beneath them began to tremble. He staggered, reaching out to steady Aera as the earth shook violently. Vaylin growled, his massive form tense and ready, as if sensing danger. What's happening? Auron shouted over the rumbling. Aera's eyes widened, her calm exterior cracking for the first time. They found us, she whispered, her voice tight with fear. They're trying to breach the gateway. Auron's stomach twisted with dread. The hunters? Aera nodded, her face pale. They're coming. Without another word, Vaylin let out a deep, resonant growl and began to lead them forward, his movements urgent and purposeful. Auron followed, his heart pounding in his chest as the tremors intensified. The sanctuary, once a place of refuge, was now shaking under the weight of the threat that had followed them here. Whatever safety the gateway had provided, it was beginning to crumble. And the hunters were relentless. They would stop at nothing to get to Aera. As they hurried across the shimmering landscape, the symbols etched into the stone structures around them began to flicker and fade, their light dimming as the ground quaked beneath their feet. Auron's mind raced, desperately searching for a solution. They couldn't outrun the hunters forever. They needed a plan, something to stop them before it was too late. Aera, Auron called out, his voice strained. How do we stop them? Is there a way to close the gateway for good? Aera looked back at him, her expression filled with a mixture of fear and determination. There is, but it requires more power than I have alone. Vaylin, as if understanding her words, turned to face Auron. His glowing eyes bore into Auron's, and a realization struck him like a thunderbolt. The pendant. It wasn't just an artifact, it was a key, a part of the ancient power Aera spoke of. We can do it together, Aera said softly, her voice trembling with urgency. You, me, and Vaylin. We can seal the gateway, but we have to do it now. Auron's heart pounded in his chest. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, but he knew there was no other choice. They had to act, or everything would be lost. With a deep breath, he nodded. Let's do it. Auron's heart hammered in his chest as he processed Aera's words. Sealing the gateway was their only chance, but it meant trusting in a power he didn't fully understand. Vaylin stood beside him, his intense gaze filled with a silent promise of protection, while Aera, calm yet urgent, prepared herself for the task ahead. The ground continued to tremble beneath them, and the alien landscape seemed to pulse with a strange energy as if reacting to the presence of the hunters who were closing in. The glowing symbols on the towering stone structures flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows across the dark horizon. Time was running out. We don't have much longer, Aera said, her voice small but steady. She reached up and touched the glowing pendant around Vaylin's neck, the very object that had first hinted at the deeper mysteries surrounding her. This pendant, it's a conduit of ancient power. It connects to the energy of this place, and through it, we can amplify the force needed to close the gateway. But what? Auron asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the panic building inside him. Aera hesitated for a moment, her silver eyes searching Auron's face. The process will drain us, me, Vaylin, and you. It will take everything we have. If we fail, the gateway will remain open, and they will capture us. Auron felt the weight of her words settle over him like a leaden cloak. There was no turning back now. The hunters were relentless, driven by a hunger for Aera's power, And if they succeeded in taking her, the consequences could ripple across the galaxy. He knew the risk, but deep down, he had already made his choice. "I'm with you," he said firmly, his eyes locking onto Aera's. "We do this together." Aera gave a small nod, her expression filled with both gratitude and determination. Valen growled low in his throat, stepping closer to them, his massive body tense and ready for whatever was to come. The three of them were bound together now, by fate, by necessity, and by a shared purpose. Without wasting another second, Aera led them toward the center of the alien sanctuary, where a massive stone platform rose from the ground. Its surface was etched with intricate runes, the same glowing symbols that lined the towering pillars and stretched out across the vast landscape. It pulsed faintly, alive with a power that hummed beneath their feet. The gateway's core was here, and it was the only thing standing between them and the relentless hunters. Auron placed his hand on the cool stone, feeling the energy thrumming through it. He could sense the immense power beneath the surface, ancient and raw, as if it had been lying dormant for centuries, waiting for this very moment. Aera knelt beside him, her small hands resting gently on the glowing runes. "We must focus," Aera instructed, her voice calm but with a sense of urgency. "We need to channel our energy through the pendant. It will allow us to access the full power of the gateway." Valen moved into position, standing beside them with his head lowered. His eyes glowed brighter than ever, reflecting the intensity of the energy building around them. Auron watched in awe as the lynx-like guardian extended his paw and pressed it against the stone, the pendant around his neck shining with a fierce light. Aera closed her eyes, her silver irises disappearing as she began to focus. The air around them grew heavy, thick with the electric charge of the ancient forces swirling within the sanctuary. Auron, unsure of how exactly he was supposed to contribute, followed her lead. He closed his eyes and placed his other hand on the stone, trying to empty his mind of fear and doubt. He let himself focus on the connection between him, Aera, and Valen. At first, nothing happened. The ground continued to tremble, and the distant sounds of the hunter's approach grew louder, but the gateway remained unchanged. Auron could feel the tension mounting. Every second counted. His heart raced, but then, just as panic threatened to consume him, something shifted. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through his bones. Auron felt a surge of warmth spread through his body, as though the energy of the platform was flowing directly into him. He opened his eyes and saw the pendant around Valen's neck glowing brighter, pulsating with a blinding intensity. The symbols on the stone beneath them began to move, swirling and shifting like a living organism, responding to the power they were channeling. Aera's small form trembled with effort, beads of sweat forming on her forehead as she concentrated. "We're almost there," she whispered, her voice strained. Auron could feel it too, the power building, the energy swirling around them like a storm. But the gateway wasn't fully sealed yet. It was close, but not enough. They needed one final push. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic sound echoed through the sanctuary, and Auron's heart sank. The hunters had arrived. He looked up, and through the dim glow of the sanctuary's lights, he saw them. 3 of the armored figures, their black suits gleaming as they stepped through the entrance. They moved with deadly precision, their weapons raised, and their focus entirely on Aera. "Keep going," Auron shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. "We're almost there." Valen snarled, his body tensing as the hunters advanced. The Lynx Guardian stepped in front of Aera, his glowing eyes fixed on the intruders. The hunters aimed their rifles at Valen, ready to fire. Auron's heart pounded in his chest. They didn't have time for a fight, not now. He could feel the energy of the gateway reaching its peak, but if the hunters stopped them, it would all be over. "Stay back," Auron shouted at the hunters, though he knew it was futile. The lead hunter stepped forward, his weapon humming with lethal energy. "Give us the child," the distorted voice ordered coldly. "She belongs to us." Auron's jaw clenched. "She belongs to no one." Before the hunter could respond, Valen moved. With a deafening roar, the Guardian leaped at the lead hunter, claws slashing through the air. The hunter fired, but Valen was too fast, dodging the energy blast with an agility that belied his size. He collided with the hunter, knocking him back with a force that sent him crashing into the stone wall. The other two hunters opened fire, their weapons glowing with deadly energy as they aimed at Valen. But the Guardian was relentless, moving with blinding speed, darting between the blasts and striking out at the hunters with precision. Auron watched in awe as Valen fought, his massive form a blur of glowing fur and fury. But despite Valen's efforts, Auron knew they couldn't hold the hunters off for long. The energy building around the gateway was nearly overwhelming now, the light so intense it cast long shadows across the sanctuary. They were so close to sealing the gateway, just a few more moments. Aera's voice broke through the chaos. Now, Auron. He snapped his focus back to the task. The power inside the pendant was at its peak, and Auron could feel the energy coursing through him, stronger than ever before. He placed both hands firmly on the stone platform, pouring everything he had into the connection. The gateway responded. The air around them shimmered, and the symbols on the pillars pulsed one final time, growing brighter and brighter until the light was nearly blinding. The entire sanctuary trembled as the gateway began to close, the space around it warping and shifting as the ancient forces locked into place. But just as the gateway began to seal, the lead hunter, battered but not defeated, rose to his feet. His weapon was raised, aimed directly at Aera. Auron's eyes widened. No. In that split second, time seemed to slow. The hunter pulled the trigger, and a bolt of deadly energy shot toward Aera. Valen moved faster than Auron could process. The great guardian lunged forward, his body intercepting the blast meant for Aera. The energy struck Valen with a deafening crack, and the massive Lynx let out a roar of pain as he collapsed to the ground. Valen! Auron shouted, his heart lurching in his chest. But Valen didn't move. The light of the gateway surged one last time, and then, with a final pulse, it sealed completely. The connection between worlds was cut, and the hunters were left standing in the now silent sanctuary. Auron knelt beside Valen, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The great Lynx lay still, his glowing eyes dimming as the life drained from his body. No, Auron whispered, his voice breaking. Valen. Aera stood beside him, her silver eyes filled with tears. She knelt down and placed her hand gently on Valen's fur, her voice trembling. He saved us, she said softly. He fulfilled his duty. As our guardian, Auron's chest tightened, grief crashing over him like a wave. Valen had given everything to protect them. The hunters, defeated and with no way to pursue them further, slowly retreated into the shadows. The sanctuary had fallen silent, but the cost of their victory was a weight that Auron could feel deep in his soul. They had survived, but at a terrible price. The clearing grew eerily still as Auron, Aera, and the mysterious figures stood together beneath the glowing canopy of the bioluminescent forest. The pendant around Auron's neck pulsed gently in rhythm with his heartbeat, its warmth a reminder of the power he carried, one he barely understood but now had to master. The cloaked figures, towering and ethereal, moved gracefully, circling Auron and Aera. Their glowing eyes flickered with an ancient wisdom, and their presence brought a calming energy that contrasted sharply with the urgency of their mission. The lead figure stepped closer, extending a hand toward the pendant. The power within this pendant is tied to the guardians who once protected your world and countless others. It is a fragment of an ancient force that has been forgotten by most, but not by the hunters. Auron nodded, his hand gripping the pendant tightly. How do I awaken its power? The figure's eyes glowed brighter. You must open your mind to its energy. Trust in the bond you share with Aera. The pendant responds to your will, and through it, you can channel the strength of the guardians. Aera, standing beside him, looked up at Auron with those piercing silver eyes. I'll guide you, Auron. Together, we can unlock the pendant's true potential. Auron took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. He had spent years wandering alone, surveying distant planets, avoiding deep connections. But now, he stood at the center of something far greater than himself. The fate of Aera, the galaxy, and the legacy of the ancient guardians rested in his hands. All right, he said, his voice steady despite the swirl of emotions inside him. "I'm ready." The figures moved closer, forming a circle around Auron and Aera. Their robes shimmered like water, rippling in the air, and the symbols on the trees and stones around them began to glow more intensely. The energy in the clearing grew palpable, a soft hum filling the air as the ancient forces began to stir. Aera reached out and gently placed her hand over Auron's, her small fingers curling around the pendant. As soon as they made contact, Auron felt a surge of warmth flow through him, stronger than anything he had felt before. His pulse quickened, and the pendant glowed with a brilliant light, casting long shadows across the clearing. "Close your eyes," Aera whispered. "Focus on the bond we share. Feel the energy of the pendant. Let it flow through you." Auron obeyed, shutting out the distractions of the world around him. He could feel Aera's presence beside him, her power intertwining with his own. The pendant pulsed with life, and suddenly, he could sense it, the immense, ancient force that lay dormant within it. It was like touching the heart of the galaxy itself, a boundless energy that surged and swirled, waiting to be unleashed. The power within the pendant responded to his will, and Auron could feel the bond between him and Aera growing stronger, deeper. Together, they were no longer two individuals. They were connected, woven into the very fabric of the universe. The figures surrounding them began to chant softly, their voices rising in perfect harmony. The energy in the air intensified, and Auron felt the ground beneath him tremble. The symbols carved into the stones around them flared with light, creating a web of glowing lines that connected the pendant to the sanctuary itself. Then, the world around them seemed to shift. Time and space bent, warping as if they stood at the center of a great cosmic storm. Auron felt the weight of the galaxy pressing down on him, but he held firm, keeping his focus on Aera and the pendant. The pendant flashed, and suddenly, a flood of memories not his own surged through Auron's mind. He saw visions of the ancient guardians, beings of immense power who had once stood watch over the galaxy, protecting it from forces of chaos. He saw Valen among them, standing tall and proud, his glowing eyes filled with purpose. The guardians had wielded the same energy that now pulsed through Auron and Aera, a force tied to the very stars. But he also saw the hunters, relentless, driven by fear and greed, their black-armored forms cutting down the guardians one by one. The last of the guardians had fallen in a final, desperate battle, leaving only fragments of their power behind, fragments like the pendant that now hung around Auron's neck. He understood now. The hunters weren't just after Aera's power. They wanted to extinguish the last remnants of the Guardian's legacy, to control the very forces that could shape the galaxy itself. Suddenly, Auron's eyes snapped open, filled with new understanding. The light from the pendant had reached its peak, glowing so brightly that the entire forest seemed to pulse with its energy. The figures around him stopped their chanting, their eyes fixed on him and Aera with quiet reverence. Aera looked up at Auron, her voice soft but filled with strength. "The power is ours now. We can stop them." Before Auron could respond, a sound shattered the stillness, the unmistakable hum of engines. The hunters had returned, descending from the sky in sleek, black ships that blotted out the stars. They had found them. The lead hunter's ship landed with a heavy thud, its dark hull gleaming in the faint light of the pendant. The ramp lowered, and the familiar, cold figures of the hunters emerged, their weapons aimed directly at Auron and Aera. "Step away from the child," the lead hunter barked, his voice cold and mechanical. "You cannot stop us." Auron stood tall, the pendant glowing brightly at his chest. "You're wrong," he said, his voice steady. "We can stop you." Aera stepped forward, her silver eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. She raised her hand, and the pendant pulsed in response. The air around them crackled with energy, and the ground trembled as the power of the guardians surged through the clearing. The hunters hesitated, their weapons faltering as the sheer force of the energy hit them. The lead hunter's helmet turned toward Auron, his voice filled with fury. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. You'll destroy yourselves." Auron clenched his fists, feeling the power of the pendant coursing through him. "Maybe, but we won't let you take her." With a final surge of will, Auron and Aera unleashed the full force of the Pendant's power. A beam of brilliant light shot out from the Pendant, arcing across the clearing and striking the hunters. The energy hit them with a deafening roar, and the ground beneath the hunters cracked and split open. The lead hunter let out a scream as the light consumed him, and his form crumbled into nothingness, disintegrating into the air. The other hunters fell one by one, their bodies dissolving into the brilliant energy of the Pendant. The ships in the sky above began to falter, their engines sputtering as the power of the Guardians disrupted their systems. One by one, the ships fell from the sky, crashing into the distant forest with thunderous booms. And then, silence. The clearing was bathed in the soft, pulsing glow of the Pendant. The hunters were gone, their threat extinguished by the very power they had sought to control. Auron stood in the center of the clearing, breathing heavily, his body trembling from the exertion. Aera stepped beside him, her hands still resting on the Pendant, her silver eyes filled with quiet triumph. "They're gone," she whispered. Auron nodded, relief flooding through him. It was over. The figures surrounding them bowed their heads, their glowing eyes filled with reverence. "The legacy of the Guardians lives on," the lead figure said softly. "You have done what many thought was impossible." Auron looked down at Aera, who smiled up at him. Together, they had stopped the hunters, saved the galaxy from a terrible fate, and awakened the power of the ancient Guardians. But as he stood there, surrounded by the quiet, glowing forest, Auron knew this was only the beginning. The galaxy was vast, filled with dangers still lurking in the shadows. But with Aera by his side, and the power of the Guardians within them, he knew they were ready for whatever came next. They had each other, and together, they would face whatever the future held. The end.